How many of you have ever read the book of Judges? Oh, well, more than I thought. When you take EFM, Dana Sue tells us, you read the book of Judges. Well, it had been a long time since I read the book of Judges, but I have to tell you, this is one of the most action-packed 21 chapters in the entire Bible. In fact, I would call the book of Judges the prototype of the American soap opera. There has never been more sex and violence. It's all right here. Now, the story, how many of you are following the story, which is kind of the narrative summary of the Bible? But the story includes Judges chapters 2 through 4, 6 through 8, and 13 through 16. Judges goes on for 21 chapters, and I'm not going to let you leave without telling you some of the juiciest parts. So here is the cast of characters. First, we get introduced to Eglon, not exactly a household name, but he is one of the enemies, and he is defeated by Ehud. I don't know how you say E-H-U-D, Ehud. But here's the interesting part, and this was probably written as comic relief. Egon was so fat that when Ehud pulled, he was left-handed, so he pulled his double-edged sword from the side of his thigh where it was hidden, and he plunged it into Eglon's belly. And he was so fat that his belly covered the sword, including the hilt. That's the beginning. Next, we encounter Deborah, who is one of the judges in the book of Judges. And she was actually one of the few in the book of Judges who functioned as a judge. She held court under a palm tree, and people would come to her with their problems, their dilemmas, and she would pass judgments on all of these different things. And she engaged the help of a warrior named Barak, spelled a little bit different from our president's name, but still the same name. And then some very interesting drama happens, which I believe is in the story version, the story of Jael, Jael. After that, we encounter Gideon. Now, if you went to Sunday school, you've probably heard of Gideon and the story about the trumpets, all the soldiers blowing their trumpets. Then we encounter Samson, and there are several interesting characters that surround Samson. There is a warrior named Jephthah, and there's a great story about his daughter, and that's one of the ones that is not included in the story version, and I'm going to tell you about that because that has been a very important story in my own life. So we encounter Samson with his mother, his wife, with Delilah. You probably maybe even saw a Hollywood version of that story. And finally, the book of Judges ends on a terrible note, perhaps the worst story in the entire Bible, the story of the Levite concubine. But here's the point in all of these characters. Judges, the book of Judges is wedged in between this long narrative about the conquering of the promised land and the monarchy. And in between that is this, it's really about a 300-year period of time, 320 years about, from 1375 BC to 1055 BC. So we're talking over 3,000 years ago. And Martin, if you catch me in any errors, you can correct me. But here's the point of the book of Judges as many scholars interpret it and as it makes sense to me. Judges is about all of these tribes of Israel who were living among their enemies in they've not conquered yet all of these peoples that they have to conquer to occupy the land that God has promised them. So they're living among their enemies. They're being oppressed by one after another. And when things would get really bad, God would raise up a judge who would lead a military campaign and would defeat that particular enemy. There would be peace for a few years, and then the cycle would begin again. I bet a lot of you have seen The Circle of Violence. Well, that's sort of what this is like. So there's a peaceful time, there's disobedience, there's oppression, the people cry out, God raises up a judge, and it just goes around and around, except it doesn't really just go around and around in a circle like this. I want you to imagine the story that we get in Judges as more of a spiral that goes downward. And the whole time those cycles are being repeated, the situation, the society of the Israelites is deteriorating. And I'll unpack that premise that I'm offering to you through the stories of some of the women in the book of Judges. Judges has a lot of women in the text, and they're very interesting. And as we go through them, kind of chronologically, I want you to pay attention to the stories of the women that we will encounter. And I'm not going to, there are really 8 different women, and we don't have that much time to tell the stories of 8 women, so I'm going to focus on 4. The first, of course, is Deborah. And Deborah is this judge, one of the judges of this period, and she is a powerful woman. She is not only a judge and a wise human being, but she is a warrior. And she doesn't need anybody to tell her what to do. She is the one who is calling the shots herself. She engages a warrior named Barak to lead a military campaign. And Barak takes an army of soldiers to the top of Mount Tabor. Now, who remembers what Mount Tabor is? It shows up again a number of times in the Bible. One of the best stories in the New Testament happens on Mount Tabor. Does anybody remember what that is? The Transfiguration? Well, this is Mount Tabor. So Barak takes his soldiers to the top of Mount Tabor, and the opposing army comes around to the bottom, and imagine 10,000 soldiers rushing down the mountain, and according to the text, they kill every one of them, all 10,000 of them. Of course, these numbers are not to be taken literally. It just means there were a lot. They killed all of them but a general whose name was Sisera. Now, here's an interesting story. Sisera, all of his soldiers are dead, so he hightails it out of there, trying to escape what he knows is the fate waiting for him, which is sure death if he is caught. But he shows up at a village, running away, and I forgot one thing about Barak, and this fleshes out a little bit Deborah's power. Barak, after Deborah tells him what he is to do, he says, well, okay, I'll do it if you'll go with me. If you won't go with me, I won't go. So clearly, in this scenario, the woman is the one with greater strength, greater inner strength to see through this campaign. So anyway, here's Sisera. He's hightailing it out of there, and he comes to the tent of a woman named Jael, Jael. And Jael encourages him to come in and accept her hospitality. He asks her for some water. He's just absolutely exhausted and probably scared to death. He shows up at the tent, he asks for water, and she gives him a skin of milk, encourages him to go to sleep and rest, and then, while he is sound asleep, she gets a tent peg. You heard this story? How many of you heard this story of Jael? A tent peg and a hammer, and she pounds the tent peg through his temple into the ground. Now, I can't quite imagine how much strength it would take to be able to do that. Or I don't know how big a tent peg was, but anyway, that is the story. And it's a terrible story. And oh, by the way, I forgot to mention this. Stories from judges never show up in the lectionary. But I kind of wish they did, because people would complain less about how boring church is if they got to hear this stuff in church. Actually, that's not quite true. There is a story about Deborah who shows up during Epiphany in year C. So once every 3 years, there is a short story of Deborah that doesn't say anything about Jael and what happened after that. And then there is, I forgot. Don't write any of this down because I may be making some mistakes. Jael is remembered through this violent act, but she is credited with saving the Israelites from the Canaanite threat. By getting rid of the general, then they are in for years of peace. And if you read the book of Judges, it will tell you that they are oppressed for this many years, and then there's the judge, and then there's the military campaign, and then there are so many years of peace. It may be 8 or 18 or 40. It varies. Each one is different. But Jael is the one who made that possible. Now, the next story, and the one that I actually want to read to you, partly because it's a story that doesn't ever make it to the lectionary, and it is a story that I encountered in seminary, and it was called A Text of Terror. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but I'm going to read the part that is about Jephthah's daughter, who is not named. Now pay attention. The first woman is given a name, and she is given a voice. The second woman is given a name, and she is given a voice. This woman is not given a name. She is referred to only as the daughter of a warrior. Now, a little background about her father, Jephthah. Jephthah was the son of a prostitute, and so he was the illegitimate son of many sons of his father. And all of his brothers pushed him away. And so we can only imagine, based on what we know about trauma now, what kind of emotional baggage Jephthah may have carried. Banned by his own family, a mighty warrior he was. When he was excluded from the family circle, he went out into the wilderness and gathered a band of robbers around him. And so he was basically an outlaw. But the people got in trouble, and knowing of his strength as a warrior, he was approached again by the very people who had excluded him, and they said, "We want you to come back and raise an army and rescue us from this threat." And he said to them, "Well, why in the world would I do that? You ran me off." "Well, if you will, then we will make you not only the general, the warrior, but we will make you the leader after the battle is over, after the war is over." And so he agreed to do that, to come back as a warrior. But this is what he does. So you can imagine how anxious he is to win this fight. He has to win, because not only does he have something to prove to his family, he probably has something to prove to himself. Here's what he does. This is from Judges 11. "Then the Spirit of the Lord came upon Jephthah, and he passed through Gilead and Manasseh. He passed on to Mizpah of Gilead, and from Mizpah of Gilead passed on to the Ammonites." There are all kind of ites in here. "And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord and said, 'If you will give the Ammonites into my hand, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house to meet me, when I return victorious from the Ammonites, shall be the Lord's, to be offered up by me as a burnt offering.' So Jephthah crossed over to the Ammonites to fight against them, and the Lord gave them into his hand. He inflicted a massive defeat on them. From the Aurora to the neighborhood of Minnith, 20 towns, and as far as Abel-Keramim. So the Ammonites were subdued before the people of Israel. Then Jephthah came to his home at Mizpah, and there was his daughter coming out to meet him with timbrels and with dancing. She was his only child. He had no son or daughter except her. When he saw her, now get this, I love this part. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and said, 'Alas, my daughter, you have brought me very low. You have become the cause of trouble to me. You have brought me very low. You are the cause of my trouble. For I have opened my mouth to the Lord, and I cannot take back my vow.' She said to him, 'My father, if you have opened your mouth to the Lord, do to me according to what has gone out of your mouth, now that the Lord has given you vengeance against your enemies, the Ammonites.' And she said to her father, 'Let this thing be done for me. Grant me 2 months, so that I may go and wander on the mountain and bewail my virginity, my companions and I.' 'Go,' he said, and sent her away for 2 months. So she departed, she and her companions, and bewailed her virginity on the mountains. At the end of the 2 months, she returned to her father, who did with her according to the vow he had made. She had never slept with a man. So there arose an Israelite custom that for 4 days every year, the daughters of Israel would go out to lament the daughter of Jephthah, the Gileadite. Now, you might wonder why, it's easy to see on one level why that story is never in the lectionary. But if we just ignore it, we can't get to something that I think is very important about this story. And remember, note the progression. A woman with name and voice, another woman with name and voice, this woman with no name but voice. Because what did she do when she heard this? She went to her father and said, "This is what I want you to do for me." In other words, she expressed her own agency. She was not a victim. "This is what I want you to do for me." And what did she do? She went out into the mountains with her girlfriends to grieve her loss. In the New York Times today, I've not even read this article yet, but Tom started reading it to me right as we were both leaving to go our separate ways. Nicholas Kristof has written yet another article about trafficking of teenage girls in this country. And the article is about some of those girls who are exhibiting their own agency and who are beginning to fight back. So a story like that, this horrible story, can inform, can offer to us a way forward in some of the horrors that are still happening now 3,000 years later. That just stuns me. The book of Judges offers no commentary about Jephthah's rash, reckless vow to God, nor does it have anything to say about her response to that. But here's something that's very interesting. When I discovered this story in seminary, I had a friend whose mother was a member of the Order of the Eastern Star. And as a member of that order, she had heard of Jephthah's daughter. And I don't know anything about Eastern Star except that it's kind of a women's version of the Masons or something sort of like that. But Jephthah's daughter is remembered as the ideal daughter for her obedience and submission. I don't like that. The next woman whose story I want to unpack a little bit, and really all of the women around the story of Samson are really interesting. And Samson, of course, is remembered for this Herculean strength, right? That's probably the one thing we think of when we think of Samson. And then we think of Delilah as the bad girl who extracted from him the secret of his strength. Do you remember this story where she went back to him? "Oh, husband, if you loved me, you would tell me the secret of your strength," and he would tell her something, and she would then reveal the secret, which was not the real secret, and it would not anyway, that went on and on and on, about 4 times, I think. And finally, she just nagged him to death until he told her the truth, that he had been set apart at his birth, before his birth. He was never to have his hair cut. And she extracted this secret from him. So Delilah is remembered as kind of a bad girl, but Samson was no hero. And I would invite you to go back and read the 2 or 3 chapters about Samson and how his story unfolds. His philandering, his falling in love with one woman and then abandoning her, and taking up with the prostitute and then marrying someone else and having lots of concubines and all of this, and just not being able to be a man of faith. And eventually, at the very end, he gets his eyes gouged out, and he dies as he pushes on the pillars of the temple, and it collapses and it kills all of them, including him. So that is yet another example of how this downward spiral, where the faithfulness of the people deteriorates. The last story let me review one more time. Deborah, a woman with name and a voice. Jael, with a name and a voice. Jephthah's daughter, no name but a voice. Delilah, who has a name and a voice. And finally, the last story in the book of Judges is about the Levite's concubine. She has no name, and she has no voice. This is at the end, so if you can imagine the moral fiber of this society has deteriorated to this terrible degree. I'm going to try to just tell you the story without reading it to you. She is the concubine, this woman who has no name, is the concubine of an unnamed Levite. She never speaks, but the text tells us that something has gone wrong between the Levite and his concubine, and she leaves him and goes to her father. After some period of time, he follows her. He wants to get her back, and the text says, if I could find it easily, I would read it to you, that he goes to find her. He wants to bring her back, and he wants to speak to her tender words. So he has feelings for her. So he goes and he finds her, and he stays for several days with her and her father. The father keeps encouraging him to stay one more night, one more night, one more night, and he really doesn't want to. And finally, even though it is late in the day, he takes this woman and they head back to wherever home is. It gets dark, it gets late, and they need a place to spend the night. So they stop in a village, hoping that someone will offer them hospitality, and no one does. They're just kind of stranded there in the village square. Finally, an old man comes upon them and invites them to come home with him, which they do. In the middle of the night, townspeople find the home where the old man, the concubine, and the man whose concubine she is. The townspeople come to this house where they are and pound on the door and demand that the host send out the Levite, because they're in enemy territory. Send out the Levite so that we may have sex with him. And the host refuses to do that. But he said, "Here, I'll give you my daughter." And the Levite gives them his concubine. So here we are in a culture where hospitality is a life and death deal. They have been offered hospitality until things get ugly. So the host protects the Levite, sends out his own daughter. The concubine is put out of the house, and she is gang raped all night long. In the morning, when the Levite opens the door, she is laying dead on the threshold of the door. He tells her to get up, and she doesn't answer. So he puts her on his donkey and goes back to his homeland. And as he does, or when he gets home, he cuts her body into 12 pieces and sends them to the 12 tribes as a warning. This is what we have become. This is what we have become. That such a thing could happen. And the very last verse of Judges 21, in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes. In other words, it had deteriorated to such a degree that there was total anarchy. So can you see that spiral, and how that spiral how that cycle, which is not really a circle but a spiral, how when you look at the treatment of the women in these 21 chapters, how that can unpack for us the condition that Israel was in when the people finally decided they wanted a king. I think it's a very interesting premise that you can evaluate the health, the moral health of a culture by how the least, or how the most vulnerable people in a culture are treated. In this case, it is women. So now, whether we are talking about how we treat our aged, how we treat people who are mentally ill, how we treat children, how we treat women, who are the vulnerable people in our culture and how are they treated? And I think this book of Judges, when seen as a whole, can really inform, can really give us some guidance in how we can look at ourselves with some real honesty. And when you pick and choose the stories, when you only hear one story in a 3-year lectionary cycle, you miss what I think is a very valuable lesson that we need to be paying attention to. Oh, I'm sorry this has been such a downer. I can tell that you're all just depressed, and it is horrible. But I am one who does not believe in cleaning up the story for the children. We are not children, right? We are one who are trying, all of us are trying to live into our calling to make a world in which all of us can thrive. And so I think that that the book of Judges is worth a look. So thank you for your attention, and I challenge you to go read the whole thing. You can really skip over the part about the Ammonites and all of that, but pay attention to the progression of the moral decay and how that moral decay is revealed by the stories of the women. Thank you so much.